The letter arrived on a Tuesday in late October, slipped under the door of the weaving shed while Sylvie Marchand was still at her loom. She did not hear it come. The shuttle was moving, the warp threads singing their low familiar note, and the world outside the shed. The cold Manitoba wind, the creak of the yard gate, the distant sound of the town going about its business, had ceased to exist the way it always did when she was working. That was the thing about weaving. It did not permit distraction. It asked for all of you, or it gave you nothing. She found the envelope when she rose to trim the lamp at dusk. It had no seal, no postage. Someone had carried it by hand. Her name was written on the front in a script she did not recognize. Angular, efficient, the handwriting of a person who wrote a great deal and had stopped being careful about it. Miss Sylvie Marchand. The estate of the late Agnes Whitmore. Agnes had been dead for 11 days. Sylvie set the envelope on the workbench beside the loom and looked at it for a long moment. The lamp cast a warm circle of light that did not quite reach the corners of the shed. It was cold. She had let the small iron stove burn down while she worked, too absorbed to notice. She noticed now. She picked up the envelope, slid it open with the tip of her shuttle hook, and read. The language was careful and impersonal in the way of legal documents, but the facts arranged themselves plainly enough. Agnes Whitmore's property, the house, the outbuildings, the 2 acres of land on the eastern edge of Millhaven, Manitoba, had passed entirely to her nephew, one Mr. Calvin Whitmore of Winnipeg, as the sole surviving blood relation. Miss Marchand, as a non-family member, held no claim. Miss Marchand was furthermore reminded that her current occupation of the weaving shed constituted tenancy at the late Mrs. Whitmore's informal arrangement, which arrangement had not been formalized in any legal instrument. Mr. Calvin Whitmore's intention was to sell the property at the earliest opportunity. Miss Marchand would be expected to vacate the premises, including the weaving shed and the small sleeping room adjacent to it, within 21 days. A check was enclosed for $40, in recognition of your service to the late Mrs. Whitmore, and as goodwill compensation for any inconvenience. $40. Sylvie turned the check over in her hands. She had lived in that shed for 4 years, since she was 19. She had learned everything she knew within its walls. Agnes had not been her employer, exactly, or even her landlord exactly. Agnes had been the closest thing to family she had left in the world, and the shed had been the closest thing to home. None of that, it turned out, was written anywhere. She set the check on the workbench beside the loom. She did not weep. Agnes had taught her that tears were for private moments, not for business, and this, cold and blunt as it was business. She looked around the shed. The great floor loom Agnes had built herself 40 years ago, its beam worn smooth by 10,000 hours of work. The shelves of yarn wound in careful hanks, every color sorted and labeled in Agnes's faded handwriting. The pattern drafts pinned to the wall, some of them so old the paper had gone amber at the edges. The shuttle hook in Sylvie's own hand, the one Agnes had pressed on her the first winter, saying, "Your hands are the right shape for it, child. Don't argue." 21 days. She stood at the workbench long after the lamp had burned low, doing arithmetic the way Agnes had taught her. Clearly, without sentiment, on a piece of brown paper. Assets on one side, liabilities on the other. On the assets side, the $40 check. Her own savings, $26 and some cents, kept in a tin behind the yarn shelf. The shuttle hook. Her tools, the reed hook, the threading hook, the temple clamps, the bobbin winder. 4 years of skill in her hands. A partially finished commission, a blanket ordered by the minister's wife for $30, not yet collected. On the liability side, 23 years old, female, and unknown beyond Millhaven. No family, no references except from a woman who was dead. Late October in Manitoba, with winter arriving not as a season but as a verdict. The rooming houses in town ran $3 a week for a single room without board. At that rate, her money would last perhaps 2 months. Finding weaving work in Millhaven was not a possibility. There was no one else in town who wove. There was no shop that sold hand-woven goods. Agnes had sold by commission and by word of mouth, a network of relationships built over decades that had died with her. The larger towns, Brandon, Winnipeg, had mills. Mills had looms, but those looms were operated by men hired at mill wages, and they did not produce the kind of work Agnes had taught her. They produced yardage, uniform, and fast. Agnes had produced cloth. There was a difference, and the difference was everything, and explaining it to a mill foreman would be like explaining color to a man who had only ever seen in gray. Sylvie looked at the unfinished blanket on the loom. She looked at the pattern drafts on the wall. She thought about the minister's wife, who had come to the shed 3 weeks ago, and stood for an hour watching Sylvie work, asking him questions about the threading, the tie-up, the color sequence. She had wanted to know everything. She was not the first person who had stood in that doorway, drawn by the sound of the shuttle and the sight of the cloth emerging thread by thread from what seemed like nothing. People always wanted to know how it was done. The thought arrived quietly, without fanfare. Sylvie did not recognize it immediately as the thing that would save her. She turned back to the arithmetic on the brown paper and wrote, slowly, on the assets side, Agnes's pattern book. It was not a single book but a wooden box, latched with a brass catch, that sat on the highest shelf of the shed. Agnes had started it before Sylvie was born. Inside were patterns, not just drafts, but full working documents, thread counts, color sequences, notes on fiber preparation, observations about which yarns worked in which weathers, records of every commission Agnes had ever completed and what the client had paid. It was 40 years of a working weaver's knowledge, distilled and ordered with the same precision Agnes had applied to everything. Sylvie had read it cover to cover 3 times. She had thought of it as a record, a history, a tribute to Agnes's mind. She had not yet thought of it as a map. She climbed on the stool and lifted the box down from the shelf. She set it on the workbench and opened it. The papers were dense with Agnes's small handwriting, annotated and cross-referenced, with small swatches of yarn clipped to some pages and dried plant samples pressed between others. The exact shade of goldenrod Agnes used for a particular yellow, the bark Agnes boiled for her darkest brown. The real value, Sylvie thought, turning the pages slowly, is not the cloth. It's knowing how to make the cloth. She read until the lamp ran out of oil, and then she sat in the dark for a while, listening to the wind work itself around the corners of the shed. In the morning she went into town. Millhaven's main street was 3 blocks of wooden storefronts, a church, a livery, a post office, and Haverstock's General, which served the surrounding farms and homesteads for 50 kilometers in every direction. The owner, Frank Haverstock, was a man of 60 with a white beard and ink-stained fingers, who had known Agnes Whitmore for 30 years. He had attended her funeral. He had not attended it out of obligation, which told Sylvie something. She found him behind the counter, logging a delivery. She did not waste his time. Mr. Haverstock, she said, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth of it, not the kind answer. He looked up at her, set down his pen. I generally try not to give one when the other is more useful, he said. She asked him, was there any market in this part of Manitoba for hand-woven goods? Not yardage, but finished work, blankets, table runners, the kind of thing Agnes made. He considered for a moment, and she appreciated that he did not answer immediately. He was thinking about it, not performing thoughtfulness. There's a market, he said finally. But it doesn't come to Millhaven. It's in the farmhouses east of the river. The Mennonite settlements especially. They've been buying woven goods from a woman in Steinbach who died last spring. Nobody's replaced her yet. And there's the hotel in Portage la Prairie, the new one, the Meridian. They've been looking for someone to do table linens. That's a standing order, month to month, if the quality is right. Agnes supplied them a few years back, but she'd gotten too slow. Sylvie had not known about Portage la Prairie. How far, she asked. 120 kilometers by road, less by rail. She thanked him and turned to leave. He stopped her. Miss Marchand. He came around the counter. He was a tall man, which she sometimes forgot because he was so still. Agnes showed me some of your work last spring. The overshot blanket. He paused. It was better than hers, and hers was the best I'd seen. The words landed somewhere behind her ribs. She had not known Agnes had shown him that blanket. She had not known Agnes had spoken of it at all. She kept her face even. Thank you, Mr. Haverstock. He went to the storeroom and returned with a bolt of cotton muslin, a tin of beeswax, and a paper bag of dried beans. No charge, he said, in the same matter-of-fact tone he might use to announce the price of flour. Winter's hard on tools, the wax is for your heddles. The beans are because you look like you haven't eaten a proper meal since the funeral. She stood there for a moment. The kindness was not soft. It was practical, offered without ceremony, which made it harder to refuse and harder to hold on to without becoming undone. She took the parcel. Thank you, she said, and meant it more than the words allowed. She had 21 days and a box of patterns and 4 years of skill in her hands. It was not much. It was also, she was beginning to understand, more than it looked. The first thing she did when she returned to the shed was finish the minister's blanket. She worked with a focus that bordered on ferocity, the shuttle moving in its arc, the beater coming forward, the cloth growing in slow increments beneath her hands. Agnes had always said that the loom did not care about your troubles. The loom only asked, "Are your threads in order? Are you paying attention?" And she was. She paid attention to nothing else for 3 days. The minister's wife came on the 4th day. She stood in the doorway in her good coat, looking at the finished blanket laid out on the workbench, and she pressed her hand to her mouth. Agnes used to make this pattern, she said. The diamond twill. I know, Sylvie said. She taught it to me. The minister's wife paid the $30 without discussion, and then she stood for a moment with her hand on the blanket, smoothing it, not quite ready to leave. She asked, hesitantly, in the way of someone who suspects their question is foolish, whether Sylvie had ever considered teaching. Sylvie looked at her. Teaching? My sister-in-law has been trying to learn to weave for 2 years. She has a loom her father built, but no one to show her the threading. There are 3 other women I know of in the same situation. Agnes always said she was too old to take students. But she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Sylvie thought of the pattern box on the workbench. She thought of the farmhouses east of the river, the Mennonite settlements, the gap left by a dead woman in Steinbach. She thought of what Frank Haverstock had said about Portage la Prairie. She thought of Agnes at the loom, the shuttle hook in her right hand, her eyes not on the cloth but on Sylvie's hands, correcting, adjusting, showing. Not like that. Like this. Can you feel the difference? She had felt the difference. Tell your sister-in-law, Sylvie said carefully, that I am considering taking a small number of students in the new year. If she would like her name on a list, I will be in touch. The minister's wife left with the blanket under her arm and a look of quiet satisfaction on her face, as if she had solved something she'd been turning over for weeks. Sylvie stood at the workbench after she was gone and felt something she could not immediately name. It was not happiness, exactly. It was smaller than that and more solid. A hinge, perhaps. The sensation of something swinging open. The 21 days were the hardest work of her life. She wrote to the Meridian Hotel in Portage la Prairie, enclosing a sample, a strip of linen in a simple herringbone, woven from the best of Agnes's yarn, and Agnes's own invoice from 4 years prior, with a note explaining the change in circumstances and her intention to continue supplying at the same quality. She wrote to a dry goods merchant in Steinbach, whose name she found in the back of Agnes's pattern book, where Agnes had listed every supplier and buyer she'd worked with in 20 years. She finished 2 more commissioned pieces, both small, both gifts for the holiday season, pressing her hands to ache, and then passed it. She sorted the shed. She categorized Agnes's yarn inventory, made a list of what she had and what she would need. She made a budget, revised it, made it again. On the 14th day, a reply arrived from the Meridian Hotel. The manager, a man named Gerald Price, wrote that the hotel would be interested in discussing a trial order of 24 linen napkins and 6 table runners for the dining room. He named a price per piece that was fair. He asked if she could supply on a quarterly basis. On the 17th day, a woman arrived at the shed unannounced. Someone Sylvie had never met, who had heard from the minister's wife, who had heard from the minister, who had heard from someone else entirely. Her name was Louise. She was from a farm east of town. She had a loom her grandfather had brought from Ontario, and she had been trying for 3 years to teach herself from a book without success. She had been told that Agnes Whitmore had died, and that the young woman who remained might be willing to help. She stood in the doorway, holding a pattern she had tried and failed to thread, her cheeks red from the cold. She looked at Sylvie with the specific expression of someone who has been turned away enough times to be surprised by every open door. Sylvie looked at the pattern. It was a simple tabby with a twill border, the kind Agnes would have taught in the first week. The threading was wrong in 4 places. "Come in," Sylvie said. "I'll put the kettle on." She sat with Louise for 2 hours. She showed her the threading error, not just the correction but the reason, the logic of the tie-up, the way the twill float was built into the sequence from the beginning. Louise was a quick student. Her hands were farm hands, strong and precise, accustomed to fine work. By the end of the 2nd hour, she was threading the border sequence herself, slowly, with total concentration and getting it right. "That will cost you nothing," Sylvie said, as Louise was putting on her coat. "But if you want me to teach you properly, 1 afternoon a week, through the winter, I charge $2 a month." Louise said yes before the sentence was fully out. On the 21st day, Calvin Whitmore arrived to inspect his inheritance. We, if we are honest, have not yet told you about Calvin Whitmore, and perhaps we should, because he is the kind of man who requires some accounting before you meet him. He was 42 years old, a property solicitor from Winnipeg, and he had visited Millhaven exactly twice in his adult life. Once when Agnes's husband died, and once now, for Agnes's own passing. He wore good wool and carried a leather case, and spoke with the clipped efficiency of a man who has learned that time is money and has not yet considered whether money is time. He was not cruel precisely. He was indifferent, which, in certain circumstances, amounts to the same thing. He arrived at 11 in the morning, walked through the main house with a man from the land agent's office, and came to the weaving shed at past. He did not knock. The door was not locked. He stood in the doorway with his leather case and looked at Sylvie, and then at the loom, and then at the shelves of yarn and the pattern drafts on the wall, and the finished pieces stacked on the table waiting to be collected. "Miss Marchand," he said. "I trust you've received the letter." "I have," she said. She did not stand. He looked at the loom again. "Is this equipment part of the estate?" "Agnes built that loom before I was born," Sylvie said. "It's part of the property." He made a note. The land agent's man hovered in the doorway behind him, not quite meeting anyone's eyes. "I'll need the shed cleared within the week," Calvin Whitmore said. "We have a buyer interested in the whole parcel, and they'd like to do a full inspection." "I have until the 21st, Sylvie said. "Today is the 21st. "It is," she said. "And today I am still here." There was a silence. Calvin Whitmore looked at her again, this time with a flicker of something, not quite respect, but the recalibration of a man who has expected a problem to be simpler than it is. He left. He would be back in the morning, he said. He expected the shed to be empty. That night, Sylvie worked until 2 in the morning, not from panic but from precision. She was not packing to leave. She was packing to move. There was a difference, and the difference mattered to her, the way most differences mattered. Entirely. Frank Haverstock had spoken, 3 days prior, of an empty storage room behind his shop. It was not large. It had a window on the south wall, and a wood stove that needed a new pipe section and floorboards that creaked in the cold. It was not the weaving shed. It was not Agnes's. But it was dry, and it faced south, and the rent he'd named was $1.50 a month, which was less than she'd expected. She had said yes. She moved the pattern box first, then her tools, wrapped in cloth and settled in the wooden crate she'd used to carry them from her previous life into this one. Then the yarn, sorted into types and wound carefully so it would not tangle. She left the loom. It was part of the property. She had said so, and she had meant it. It belonged to the estate, to Calvin Whitmore's ledger, to whoever bought the land and would likely not know what it was or what it had made. She left it with a clean shed around it, the floor swept, the equipment hung in its proper place. It seemed important to leave it right. She carried the shuttle hook in her coat pocket. Agnes had given it to her on a January morning 4 years ago, pressing it into her palm without ceremony. It was old boxwood, worn dark at the tip where 10,000 years of thread had passed through it. It was the only thing in the shed that had not, in some legal sense, belonged to Agnes alone. "Your hands are the right shape for it," Agnes had said. "Don't argue." She had not argued then. She did not argue now. She put it in her pocket and walked out into the dark. The storage room behind Haverstock's was cold when she arrived. Cold enough that her breath came in small clouds and the floorboards felt like stone through her boots. She built a fire in the stove with the wood Frank had left stacked by the door. Dry spruce, it caught fast, and waited for the room to come up to temperature. She set the pattern box on the floor in the circle of lamplight. She looked at the south-facing window, dark and blank with the night beyond it. In January, she thought, the sun would come through that window for 5 or 6 hours. The stove would hold the heat in the stone of the walls. It was a smaller room than the shed, but it was solid, and it was hers, and it faced the right direction. She had $40 from Calvin Whitmore's cheque, 26 from her tin, and 30 from the minister's blanket. She had a confirmed order from the Meridian Hotel. She had a student, and word of a second, and the minister's wife's address book, which contained more names than the minister's wife had perhaps intended to share. She had Agnes's 40 years of knowledge in a wooden box, and 4 years of her own in her hands, and a shuttle hook that fit her grip like it had been made for her. It was not a fortune. It was a beginning, which, if you looked at it honestly, was the only thing a fortune ever actually was. The first winter in that back room was the hardest and the best of her life, which is the way most first winters are when they matter. She wove in the mornings, when the light was best and her hands were steadiest. In the afternoons she taught. By January she had 4 students coming on rotation. Louise from the farm east of town, 2 sisters whose mother had known Agnes, and a girl of 16 whose father ran the feed mill, and who had the most naturally gifted hands Sylvie had ever seen outside her own. She charged them each $2 a month, and she taught them from Agnes's pattern book. Starting at the beginning, warp calculation, color theory, tie-up logic, the way the loom thought. She did not simplify. She had learned from a woman who did not simplify, and she understood now why that was the right way. Word moved through the countryside the way word does in places where everyone knows everyone, slowly, and then all at once. By February, She had a letter from a woman in Portage-la-Prairie asking if she ever taught outside Millhaven. By March, a request from a church hall in Carberry for a demonstration. By April, the Meridian Hotel had doubled its standing order, and Mr. Gerald Price had recommended her to a colleague in Brandon. She worked with the same focused attention the loom demanded, all of her, or it gave her nothing. She kept accounts the way Agnes had taught her, in a notebook that was becoming. She noticed, not unlike the pattern box, dense with information, annotated and cross-referenced, a record of a working life. And then the thing that she had not anticipated happened, the way the best things always do, not as a triumph but as a practical consequence of having paid careful attention. In May, a woman arrived from Winnipeg. Her name was Mrs. Dorothy Slade, and she was the purchasing officer for the Canadian Pacific Railway's Hotel Division, which managed a collection of grand hotels along the transcontinental line. She had heard about a young weaver in Millhaven through a chain of referrals she described as absurdly long, and which Sylvie recognized immediately as the shape of Agnes's network, still moving in the world 3 seasons after Agnes had left it. Mrs. Slade sat in the back room behind Haverstocks and drank tea and looked at everything with professional attention. The cloth on the loom, the finished pieces on the shelves, the pattern box open on the table between them. She picked up a table runner and examined the selvage edge with the close focus of someone who knew exactly what she was looking at. "This threading," she said. "It's a traditional Canadian overshot pattern. You don't see it much anymore." "Agnes Whitmore's draft," Sylvie said. "She documented every pattern she ever worked. The book goes back 40 years. Mrs. Slade looked at the pattern box with a different expression than she had worn before. Not the professional attention of a buyer, but something more careful, more considered. "The railway hotels have been purchasing imported table linens for 20 years, she said. "There has been pressure recently. Internal pressure from the board to source more Canadian goods, particularly goods with a story. The kind of thing a traveler remembers." She looked at Sylvie. "I don't suppose you've ever thought about what it would mean to supply at volume." Sylvie thought of the arithmetic she had done in October, alone in the cold shed with the lamp burning low. She thought of Agnes at the loom. She thought of Louise threading the border sequence with total concentration, getting it right. "I have students," Sylvie said. 4 at present. 2 of them ready to work independently by autumn. Mrs. Slade set down the table runner. "Then let us talk," she said, "about what volume might actually look like." The agreement took 6 weeks to negotiate and was handled through a lawyer Frank Haverstock recommended, a careful woman in Brandon, who read every clause twice and charged her rates accordingly, which Sylvie paid without complaint because Agnes had taught her that cheap legal work was the most expensive kind. The contract was not large, not by railway standards, but it was real, and it was in writing, and it contained her name and the name she chose for the work. The Whitmore Pattern Collective, because the knowledge was Agnes's, and it seemed right to say so. The settlement that Calvin Whitmore's letter had called goodwill compensation, $40 for a life upended and a home taken, was, by the following autumn, the smallest amount of money Sylvie Marchand handled in a week. She did not move back to the shed on Agnes's land. Someone else bought the property in the end, a family from Ontario, and they tore the shed down to build a barn. She heard about it without particular pain. The shed had been a place. The work was not a place. It moved with her. She stayed in the room behind Haverstocks through that first winter and into the spring, and then she rented a proper space on the main street. 2 rooms with south-facing windows and a wood stove, and room for 3 looms. And she hung a sign above the door. She taught, she wove, she kept her accounts, she wrote letters, she built slowly, and without drama the thing that Agnes had spent 40 years building. Except she built it with the full shape of what Agnes had known, and that made it different. That made it larger. Agnes had been a weaver. Sylvie was becoming something harder to name. Not just a weaver but a keeper of the knowledge, a transmitter of it, the person who would see that it did not die, with one woman in one shed in one small Manitoba town. The shuttle hook stayed in her apron pocket. She used it every day. There are people in this world who are defeated by the moment they are handed an envelope they did not want to receive, and there are people who look at that envelope and begin, very quietly, to plan. We think you know which kind of person matters in the long run. We think, if we are being honest about it, that you may know which kind of person you are too. Sylvie Marchand lost her home, her mentor, and everything she had been told to count on. What she kept was a wooden hook, a box of patterns, and the knowledge of what to do with both. That turned out to be enough. It turned out, in fact, to be everything. We wonder if there is something in your own life, a skill, a piece of knowledge, a tool worn smooth from use, that you have not yet understood the full value of. What do you think that might be?